Malaysia's Prime Minister dissolves parliament and calls an early election. With its legality in question, the government insists a fresh vote could solve its dysfunction. But the opposition says a November election would put voters at risk while protecting ruling party members accused and convicted of corruption. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Malaysia. Infighting in Malaysia's ruling coalition has come to a head. Believing the current government is no longer sustainable and that his UMNO party can win a clear mandate to govern, Prime Minister Ismail Sabri Yaakob dissolved parliament and called for an early election. He says it will put the people's voice above politics.
With this announcement, the mandate will be returned to the people. The people's mandate is a powerful antidote for the country to manifest political stability and create a strong, stable and respected government after the 15th general election.
But for Malaysia's opposition, November's vote is more about keeping the ruling party in power and keeping its members out of prison. More specifically, former Premier Najib Razak and party president Ahmad Zahid Hamidi. Both were caught up in the 1MDB corruption scandal that sent Razak to prison and left Zahid potentially facing jail time. Acutely aware that Najib Razak could be released, former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad warned Malaysians about what he sees as the nefarious intentions behind a snap election.
But should they be able to win and form the government, that is their first objective. Not about the welfare of the people, not about the banjir and all these things. All these things are minor. What is important is Najib must be Najib must be released, pardoned, and Zahid, of course, the charges will be dropped, and the other charges on 1MDB that is going on now against Najib should also be dropped.
Now, whether you fall on the side of the government or the opposition, holding the vote in November, 9 months before Parliament's term is supposed to end, is a dangerous move. November is monsoon season in Malaysia, which can bring deadly floods. Last year, 50 people were killed and thousands were displaced. And according to one opposition party spokesperson, they are willing to gamble with the lives of the people and the loss of property and belongings due to floods just to satisfy the political desires of UMNO. So not only are political motivations in question, but the legality of calling an election is in question as well. So much so that my first guest today is now suing the government for breaching the Constitution. Charles Santiago is a former Malaysian MP and member of the Democratic Action Party. He joins me now from Kuala Lumpur. Thanks so much for being with me. You know, your case, claiming that calling this election is actually illegal, really aims to stop the vote in November altogether. So let's start there. Tell me why you want this election stopped.
Thanks for that important question. I think this is a question that the entire country is also asking. And there are a couple of reasons why I took the decision after having consulted lawyers, senior lawyers and constitutional lawyers, to take a civil suit against the government of Malaysia. One, the decision to dissolve parliament, must be based on a cabinet decision. That means the cabinet must have made a decision, and that decision is then forwarded to the king by the prime minister. But the important point here is it must be a cabinet decision. We now know that 12 members of the cabinet had written separately to the king, suggesting to him that they do not support the dissolution of parliament. And in fact, one member of the cabinet also said that the decision to dissolve was not even discussed in cabinet. So this tells you that it violates the Article 41 of the Constitution. Number two, having an elections during a typhoon period, and we saw a typhoon, massive typhoon last year.
Right.
And if that was going to happen again, it is going to impinge on the rights of people, the right to vote. And that would be Article 119(1) of the Federal Constitution. 119(1) of the Constitution says that there is a right to vote, but now people will be voting in a flood environment. Polling stations could be flooded. Access to the schools where people will be voting could also be flooded. Their own respective places of staying could also be flooded. People traveling from one place to another, say
Right.
from West Coast, East Coast to vote, might not be able to reach the polling booth, or because the roads are also flooded. Now, this is a common occurrence. Last year it was quite, and this is not something that's hypothetical. In fact, yesterday morning,
Let me just interrupt you there before you go too far on the actual logistics of the vote and the fact that it is during this dangerous monsoon season. Because not only do you think the Constitution is on your side in this case, sounds like you have evidence to show that the cabinet that not only needed to approve this move actually had a significant number of members rejecting this. Is that public knowledge? Are Malaysians aware?
Yes.
Yeah. So
It's public. Everybody knows about it. It has been published in the newspapers. It's public knowledge.
Then do you think you will win this case?
Well, winning and losing depends on the decision of the courts. That's something that they have to make a decision. But in terms of the public perception, the people's court, people generally agree that there is a violation, has been a violation, and people, I mean the ordinary voter, his life is now at stake in going to vote, and that it becomes a further problem. And in this sense, people's motivation to vote becomes less and less because they do not want to vote in an environment where it could be flooding, where access to the polling station might not be there, and this stifles democracy and the ability for people to shape the next government.
Okay.
And therefore, what this will lead to potentially is less and less voters might turn out to vote, and that's exactly what these guys want.
Let me ask you: if you win, what happens? Where does that leave the actual government?
Well, basically, if we win, which will be highly welcome, it means that you cannot go ahead with the elections.
Okay, and then what? Because Parliament has been dissolved. Malaysia doesn't actually have an active government. Will that Parliament have to be reassembled under a government who doesn't want to work with the Parliament that's formed?
I think basically this goes back again to a legal question, and I think the legal scholars and the courts can decide how to go forward with this, though. But I think for right now, the elections actually can take place anytime in the next 6 months.
Okay, but other than the legal question, what's good for Malaysians? There is so much at stake right now. You're expecting massive flooding. You know the economy needs desperate help and good governance right now to protect itself. What is there for Malaysians in this?
Well, I think Malaysians are basically saying, why are we voting when we know that our environment is going to be flooded? Why are we doing it, and whose interest does this serve? So people generally know that this serves the interest of what we call the court cluster within UMNO. It is they who are really pushing for these elections to happen, and they've got it. And I wrote a piece on this, and I said this is a power grab by elements within UMNO in order to have an elections, so that they will not be confronting they don't have to go through the legal process because of the corruption, and also not face jail as well.
Charles, last question for you. You know, many said it showed that justice prevails in Malaysia when Najib Razak was convicted of corruption in the 1MDB scandal. But we're hearing now that he may be released via a royal pardon. First of all, do you think that will happen? And how does all of this leave you feeling about your country right now, the integrity of its justice system and its own politicians?
Well, let me just begin by saying this. There was a lot of hope when the federal court found the former prime minister guilty and sent him to jail. I mean, you can see an euphoric response. But at the same time, there's another segment of the community that said, "Oh, this was actually he was denied justice. He was denied justice by the court itself. Now, this is fabrication. He had 4 years in jail, a 4 years process that took place from the High Court, Appeals Court, as well as the Federal Court, involving 9 judges. And it was unanimous, though, totally unanimous. So that's the point one. The point number two is one of the purpose of this election is for UMNO to win. And if they win, the next prime minister would be the president of UMNO at this time, Ahmad Zahid, Dr. Ahmad Zahid. And the first thing he will do is to make sure that the pardon for Najib takes place. So this is, you elect UMNO, you get a new prime minister who will be Ahmad Zahid. And number two, a pardon for Najib will most likely almost happen.
Okay.
This is something that people are quite upset about.
Okay, well, we'll have to see how that manifests in the election, whether it happens in November or in 6 to 9 months' time. Charles Santiago, we'll have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you so much for being with us on the Newsmakers. Well, let's broaden out this conversation now and cross to our panel in Kuala Lumpur. Ong Kian Ming is a member of parliament with the DAP and the former Deputy Minister of International Trade and Industry. We also have political analyst and columnist KK Tan, and Hafidzi Razali is a senior analyst for Bauer Asia Group. Thanks all so much for being with us. Ong Kian Ming, let me start with you. I mean, you just heard the interview I conducted with Charles Santiago. Do you think the government should actually be worried about this lawsuit that he's filed? Does it breach the Constitution? And would calling it off, if he wins, be good for Malaysia?
Thanks for having me. I applaud what my colleague Charles Santiago is trying to do, but given the precedents in Malaysia, I don't think any court in Malaysia is likely to overturn the decision by the Prime Minister to dissolve Parliament, which has gotten the consent of the King in Malaysia. So we are anticipating that the elections will proceed as probably within 60 days.
Okay, and in that, as you know, there have been complaints from various parties. Of course, one massive problem is it's been scheduled during monsoon season, when, the focus should really be on protecting people from potentially massive flooding and not sending them out to vote. So, Ong Kian Ming, is that an exaggeration? Do you think that this calling it during monsoon season and saying that's genuinely putting people in danger is an exaggeration?
It is not an exaggeration, because last year around this time, there were very serious floods that happened all across the country, including in my own constituency. I had to take a boat and go and paddle up to people's houses and rescue them from their houses. They were seeking shelter on the roofs of their houses because the water had gone up to the first floor of their houses. So it is a very serious issue, and we need to pay very serious attention to this issue rather than to have to campaign for an election. Okay.
KK Tan, of course, the government says that this is about solving government dysfunction, that the government simply can't work until another election is held. And hopefully the ruling party thinks it can get a majority and rule with a better mandate, a stronger mandate. What do you think?
Well, I think enough have been said from all sides. The Prime Minister explained why he was in a way forced to call or propose a dissolution of the Parliament. His opponents have said otherwise, that he shouldn't. I think they all have their own arguments, of course. The Prime Minister explained that he was forced to because his own ruling colleagues in the cabinet has in a way betrayed him by writing directly to the King. And also the head of the coalition partner, we call it Perikatan Nasional, Tan Sri Muhyiddin, has come out openly to say that UMNO, the party the Prime Minister belongs to, is the main enemy. So of course it makes the situation very untenable for the administration to go on this way. So in a sense, I think if you hear the explanation of the Prime Minister, he seems to have a rationale why he has no choice but to call for a general election. And of course, there were arguments from all sides whether the King should have approved. Actually, the King has the power to say no. And why did he agree? Because then there's another argument that even if the King say yes, and if the real flooding comes seriously by the time of the polling, the king does have the residual power to call the state of emergency and to postpone the polling as well. So there are many issues to this. I think we have to move one step further. But I think we should all, my advice now, as Ong Kian Ming said also, despite the challenge by the former member of parliament for Klang on the legality of this election, I think we should accept that it's likely to go ahead and we should
Okay.
prepare for it. So my argument, my point of view is to tell people, tell all the political party, the water is under the bridge now.
Okay.
I think all the political party must focus on what they can offer to the country. That should be the gist of our argument.
Okay.
I'm just afraid that the water will go above people's houses, not under the bridge.
Interesting commentary there. Okay, let me get to Hafidzi Razali, because other than the concerns about the potentially massive flooding even, there are also other concerns about holding this election in November. Many people have commented on the state of the economy and how this is not helping. What do you think?
I think the reason why the election is called so soon has got nothing to do with the economy. I think the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Ismail Sabri, is pressured from the internal camps within UMNO, by the grassroots, by the top leadership. He has no more rooms to go, and the only way that he could proceed forward is for him to build consensus among his colleagues and call for the election. But interestingly, it also doesn't guarantee that he will become the Prime Minister. So it's interesting. It will be interesting to observe on what would happen once the ruling coalition wins, or if they were to win, who would be the nominee for the prime minister, to be the prime minister.
Right, but I wasn't actually asking about how that the election was being called because of the economy. I'm asking what the effect, as you had some comments on about how it could affect the economy going forward.
Yeah, of course, for the economy, it's better from the point of view of investors to have political stability in the country, because this has been going on for the past years, for the past 2-3 years at least. We have changed prime ministers 3 times already since 2018. So from the point of view of investors, the political stability that comes with the election, the conclusion of the election, would assure that there is some sort of policy certainty that can guide their decisions forward. Investors have been holding on to their investments. They are not sure on what will be the policies, because the policies are usually tied to the decisions by the executive. So from the point of view of the investors and from the market,
Right.
especially, it's good to have this certainty, and the fact that we finally have a date to look forward to will assure that the problems, the political uncertainties, and that we have now will probably get resolved, even though that would still depend on the outcome of the election, because there's still a possibility of a loose coalition in which imbalances could still happen within the coalition that would probably form the next government.
And Ong Kian Ming, you had expressed your fears about what this election would actually produce as far as politicians are concerned. I mean, has Malaysia somehow been sentenced to the same group of politicians over and over who can continuously accuse each other of being corrupt, some even charged and convicted of corruption? You've even said that you think Malaysia has to decide at this point whether it wants to return to kleptocracy.
Yeah, I think just another point on the economy. The finance minister from the government actually tabled the 2023 budget last Friday. And I think it would have been good for investor confidence if we had gone through with the parliamentary sitting, discussed and debated the budget, and also passed the budget, around December. Right now, we have a budget that has been tabled but has not been passed, and is likely going to be passed only next year, which I think does not give much investor confidence, especially if we end up with a hung parliament, right? And I think back to the question that you asked just now, the voters have to decide between whether they want to go back to the situation before 2018, where you had an outgoing prime minister that was implicated in 1MDB scandals, and then we have possibly another prime minister that may come in from UMNO who has 47 charges of abuse of funds and corruption against him that are going through the courts now. So I think it is a serious decision that the Malaysian voters have to make on whether they want to return to kleptocracy or once and for all move on with a situation whereby we can move ahead and wipe the slate clean, and look forward to new leadership.
Right. KK Tan, do you think there's a need for new leadership, or is it better to perhaps have experienced politicians running the country at this point?
Well, I have my own crystal ball analysis on predicting the outcome of this general election. Before that, I want to say that, to be fair, the incumbent Prime Minister, Ismail Sabri, who took office only in August last year, over a 14-month period in office, has not done too badly for the following four reasons. Firstly, there was no major scandal associated with him as we in the previous election in 2018, when the incumbent Prime Minister was heavily implicated with the 1MDB scandal. Number two, he was able to restore some degree of political stability by signing an MOU with the main opposition alliance, Pakatan Harapan. Number three, there were some good laws being approved by cabinet and some even being passed, such as the anti-hopping law, greater recognition of Sabah and Sarawak as regional states and some autonomy with the Malaysian Agreement 63. And also his cabinet has decided to change the law on mandatory death sentence, but yet to be passed in parliament. So there are some achievement. And also politically, he has managed to win the state election in Malacca under UMNO.
Okay.
His party has won handsomely in Malacca in November last year. And in Johor state election in March this year, his party also won handsomely, UMNO. And I mean, you have to give him some credit. Of course, the main reason then was the low voters turnout. But I can tell you now, the situation today in GE15 is changed quite drastically for three main reasons. Number one,
okay, you know what? Right. I want to give everybody equal time here, because I want to take what you've said and put this to Hafidzi Razali, because many are saying that there will be a fundamental role played by young voters in this election, whenever it happens, that they are fed up with corruption. What role do you think they'll actually play? Some are saying they're the kingmakers. What's your take?
Yeah, this election is going to see 5.6 million new voters coming from the automatic registration, as well as the fact that the voting age has been lowered to 18 years old instead of the previous 21. But we don't have enough data to see which way they're gonna vote. There are also concerns if the young voters will even come out to vote, and it's a wild card. And a lot of parties are clamoring for the support from the young, and there's just not enough information to tell what exactly will be the political act, or what will be the political decision of these young voters. Because you have to understand that just because they're young, it doesn't mean that they're going to vote for parties that are necessarily advantageous to their interests. Because the research, initial research, preliminary research has shown that despite them being young, there's also a high tendency for them to opt for parties that their parents have, their parents prefer, or there is also a likelihood of them voting for parties that might not necessarily represent the greater national interest. So what's lacking here is actually the political education of what young voters can actually do with the powers that they have. And it remains to be seen whether the political awareness campaigns that have been done by political parties, especially on the opposition spectrum, would actually enable voters to make the right decision and to think that a certain decision, to think that it's better to vote for the more youth-oriented agenda compared to the other options.
Interesting. I mean,
can I just add this important point? I think in the last general election, GE14, there were 14.9 million registered voters. In this coming election, there are 22.7 million registered voters, an increase of 7.8 million voters, out of which 4 million of them are from 18 to 21 years old, 4 million, representing an increase of 27%. Now, as far as I know from my links with some of these young leaders, which I mix with, you can see that young people tend to be more idealistic.
You know, they also have, if they're not looking at the old guard, it's interesting to see former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad still in the mix, not saying he won't be the next prime minister. He's saying he doesn't think he'll be. He's 97 years old. Do you think young voters want to see more of that?
No, I think young voters want to see younger leaders come into the picture. So, for example, myself, I'm 47 this year, not considered particularly old, but I'm making way and I'm not contesting in the next general election. And the candidate that will replace me is somebody who is in his 30s, a young professional lawyer. So I hope that my party and other parties in my coalition can also do the same by fielding more younger candidates.
That will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Newsmakers. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.